Welcome to the Ocean Science Discovery Lab. I'm scientist Sarah, and this is my helper,
Theo Honnold.
Theo Honnold is my son. How old are you, Theo? 9. Theo's going to be the student today in the lab, doing everything that you would do if you were here in the lab with me. Our program today is sea otters. So we know sea otters, they're pretty cute, they're pretty fuzzy. We see them floating around on their backs out in the ocean. But there's something very special about them. They're considered a keystone species. What's a keystone, you're saying? Well, keystone comes from building bridges or arches. A keystone is a very important stone because without it, the whole arch will collapse. So when you take a keystone out, the bridge collapses. When applied to a species, that means that that particular species is so important in its environment that if it's taken away, all the other animals and plants that live there are going to change somehow. Maybe they'll move away. Some other ones might come in, but the whole ecosystem changes. So that keystone species keeps it all together. Next, I'm going to introduce you to a special helper. This is Oswald, the sea otter pelt. Oswald was an otter that lived near Homer, Alaska, and washed up on a beach one day and was found by a biologist. Biologists looked at Oswald, and Oswald was dead, and decided he wanted to find out more about him. So he looked at his teeth, which aren't here, but his teeth were very worn down, meaning that he had eaten a lot in his lifetime. And they figured out that Oswald was 16 years old, pretty old for a sea otter. And he probably couldn't eat very well anymore, and so he died washed up on shore. The biologist was nice enough to pass on his otter skin and fur to us to teach students about sea otters. Theo, how does this feel to you?
Very soft.
Very soft, yeah. So sea otters are in the weasel family, and there's some other weasels we have here in Kodiak. Theo, do you know what they are?
Ermines?
Ermines, very good. Ermines are in the weasel family. Those are those little animals that bound around, are pretty fearless this time of year. In the winter, they're white, and in summer, they've got a brown back and white belly. They're kind of like a miniature version of an otter. Have you seen anything else that looks like a cousin to the sea otter?
Riders, like an old woman's lake.
Yeah, we've seen what we call here in Kodiak land otters. Most people call them river otters. These are otters, they don't need the ocean to live, although sometimes we do see them swimming in the ocean. They do just fine without it. Yep, they live in lakes and rivers. And Theo was saying that we saw one up on Old Woman's Mountain in a lake there, far from the ocean. He was doing just fine in that lake. So otters can be on land, they can be in the ocean, and they're related to other animals like ermines and weasels. They're all mammals. Theo, do you know what makes a mammal a mammal?
They have fur.
They've got fur.
And they're warm-blooded, and they drink milk, and they're live birth.
That's right, very good. What else is a mammal?
A deer.
A deer, yeah. Anything else?
Bear.
Bears, yeah. Even us, we're mammals.
Because we have hair.
Yep, we got hair too. So we know what mammals are, but what's a marine mammal? Do you know what marine is?
It's like the ocean.
Ocean, so mammals that live in the ocean, that need the ocean to live.
So like seals and sea lions?
Yeah, very good. What else can you think of?
Whales.
Whales,
Dolphins. Otters.
And sea otters. Yep, sea otters are marine mammals. So whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, sea lions. We see a lot of these things around Kodiak. They're all marine mammals because they depend on the ocean to live, and they spend their entire lives in the ocean. Now, that ocean's pretty darn cold though. They gotta stay warm somehow.
At least in Alaska and Hawaii it's warm.
Yeah, the water in Hawaii is warmer than here. You know what? Water draws out your body heat way faster than air. That means that if you're swimming in the ocean, you're gonna get colder in the ocean faster than on land, even if it's warm like Hawaii. So what do animals that live in the ocean all the time, those mammals, how do they keep warm like a whale? How does that stay warm?
Blubber.
Blubber, yeah. They've got that nice thick layer of fat to keep them really insulated and warm. Let's see, what about a sea otter though? It's not really fat, it doesn't have much blubber. What do you think it uses?
It's thick fur?
It's thick fur, yeah. Sea otters have the densest fur of any animal on the planet. As a matter of fact, this 1 square inch of fur here, it has over 1 million hairs just in this one little square inch.
There's like 100 of them. So.
There's lots of them. Yep. That's 17 times more hair than on a dog in a square inch. So that's a lot of warm fur. So there's a second thing that otters do, sea otters do to stay warm. They eat a lot. As a matter of fact, they eat 1/3 of their body weight in a day. That's about 30%. So in comparison, like a person, a human being eats about 2 to 3% in a day, and a horse would eat like 4% of its body weight in a day. So a sea otter is eating a lot of food. Now, lucky for them, they've got a lot of things to choose from in the ocean to eat. Scientists think they eat at least 130 different kinds of animals. Yeah, that's a lot. Do you have any idea what those animals might be, Theo?
Clams.
Clams.
Sea stars.
Sea stars, yeah.
Sea urchins.
Mm-hmm. They love sea urchins. Well, that's a start on 130, but they also eat snails.
Fish.
They can even catch fish, yeah. They catch fish underwater, and they're the only marine mammal that catches fish with its paws underwater. All the other marine mammals use their mouths to catch a fish underwater. Now, another cool thing about otters when they hunt for food is they've got special pockets in their fur, right in their armpits. So when they're diving down, they get to the bottom and they say, oh, there's a clam, I'm gonna put it under my arm, and oh, here's a yummy urchin, I'm gonna put that in my pocket. And maybe they'll put a snail in the other one, and then, oh, here's a rock. I'll take that too. But wait, rocks don't taste good. What do they use the rocks for?
To raise the sea urchins.
Very good. So when the sea otter swims back to the surface and flips over on its back, uses its belly as its dining table, takes out that urchin, grabs its rock from its pocket, and crunch, 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 and has some sushi. All right, so we know the sea otters have to eat a lot to stay warm, to help them stay warm in addition to their fur. So when we say a lot, what are we talking about? Are we saying like 3 sea urchins a day or 500 sea urchins a day? Well, so we gotta figure out what 1/3 of a sea otter's body weight is. We're gonna do that, Theo. But first we have to think like scientists. Now, scientists use the metric system the world over to measure things. And when we want to weigh something in the metric system, what do we use?
Pounds.
We use kilograms in the metric system, and pounds are what we commonly use here in the United States to weigh ourselves on a scale or other heavy things. But because we're scientists, we're gonna use the metric system, and we're gonna use kilograms. So to give you an idea of how much a kilogram is, here's a bag of rice that weighs a kilogram. Here's a bag of rice that weighs 1 pound. So it takes 2.2 pounds to make a kilogram. If we're weighing me or an elephant, we would use kilograms. But if we want to weigh something lighter, like a pencil or a sea urchin or a what?
Mouse.
Or a mouse, we would use grams, something much lighter. So this is what a gram is, about
1,000.
Right, 1,000 grams make up a kilogram. So you need 1,000 of these to make up a kilogram. You can write down on a piece of paper or a whiteboard, or maybe you even have a handout that your teacher gave you. But 1,000 grams equals 1 kilogram. All right, we know that an otter eats about 1/3 of its body weight. When you figure out a third of a number, what do you divide by? Do you know, Thea?
3.
3. You would divide that number by 3. Let's just make up an imaginary otter first. We know otters weigh somewhere between 20 and 39 kilograms. So our imaginary otter is going to be 30 kilograms. So we're going to write that down here on our paper. And actually, if you have the worksheet, it already has 30 on it. Now we want to figure out a third of that weight to know how much food it needs to eat. And if you've got a calculator, that's very handy. So what do you do again, Theo, to find out a third of 30? Divide it by 3. You want to do that?
30 divided by
30 divided by 3.
30 divided by
And what does that equal?
10.
10. Very good. Okay, so write down 10. Yep, you can write it there. Okay, so we know that it's eating 10 kilograms of food, this particular otter. Now does that mean it's a 10 kilogram clam that it's eating? Or maybe it's a bunch of urchins that equal 10 kilograms. But urchins we don't weigh in kilograms because they're too light. We need to weigh them in grams. Let's see, how do we convert kilograms to grams? What do you think? Do you know what we might multiply this number by to make it into grams?
1,000?
1,000, yeah. So 10 times 1,000. You can use your calculator if you want, or do it in your head. What's that? 10,000. Yeah. That means that this otter would need to eat 10,000 grams of food a day. Now let's take Oswald as our next example. We know that Oswald weighed 36 kilograms. That's what the biologist told us. And what do we divide that by to find a third of its body weight?
3.
3, that's right. So divide 36 by 3.
12.
12, okay. Now you can write that in the next box. We know that Oswald would need to eat 12 kilograms of food a day. Okay, so we want to make that into grams. What do we multiply it by? 1,000. So 12 times 1,000 equals 12,000. Okay, Oswald needs to eat 12,000 grams of food a day. So write that number down. 12,000, yep. Now we're gonna pretend, Theo, that you are a sea otter. Little whiskers on you and cute little ears. And now we're gonna weigh you and find out how many kilograms you are. What does it say?
28.2.
Okay, we're just gonna call that 28. So why don't you write 28 kilograms for you? Now, if you're watching this and you just happen to know how many kilograms you are, you can write that down. Yep, right there. If you know how many pounds you are, you can take that number and your calculator and multiply it by 0.45, and that will give you how many kilograms you weigh. If you just want to use Theo's weight, that's fine too. All right, so now we need a third of your otter body weight. So what do you divide 28 by? 3.
Otters can't talk.
Oh, otters can't talk. Well, you're a special otter. You're a talking otter. So we need to figure out what a third of 28 is. You want to figure that out?
28
9.33. So you can write that down. And then to make it into grams, what do we multiply it by? 1,000, very good. Okay, so 9.33 times 1,000 equals?
33.33.
Yeah, how about 9,330? That sounds like a good number to me. So, we've got all these numbers. How does that help us? We know how many grams of food Oswald needs to eat and how many grams of food Theo the otter needs to eat. That still doesn't tell us how many urchins. Wow, how much does an urchin weigh? That's what we need to figure out next. I just happen to have some urchins here. You want to pick it up? Can you reach in there? And see if you can pick it up pretty fast so it doesn't stick on. Just pull it up. There you go. And take it out of the water. You can, hand it to me. I'm gonna sit back down. And we'll take a look at this urchin. You can see it's got some spines that keeps most animals from eating it. Except otters. They're pretty smart. They can crack that thing open and eat it. It also has some little tube feet, which are gonna be probably hard to see, but that's what helps them walk around. And then right in the middle here is their mouth. They've got 5 sharp teeth in there they use for grazing algae off of rocks or eating bull kelp, which is one of their favorite things to eat. We'll turn our scale on. Remember this guy's light, so it needs grams. This scale is a small scale and weighs in grams. So we'll put our urchin down on it. What does it say?
64.2.
64.2 grams. So why don't you write that down on your papers? Yep, you can write it down on your paper. So we know one sea urchin weighs, we'll just call that 64. So we know one sea urchin weighs 64 grams, and Oswald needs to eat 12,000 grams of food. Any idea how we might figure that out?
No.
Okay, that's a valid answer. So we will take the number of grams of food that Oswald needs to eat, 12,000, and we are going to divide that by what one urchin weighs. 64 grams, and that will tell us how many urchins that Oswald needs to eat. So all right, use your calculator. We're gonna put our urchin friend back. So 12,000 grams
divided
by 64
equals 187.5.
That's a lot of urchins. All right, well, what about you as an otter? How would you figure that out? You needed 9,330 grams of food. So why don't you write that number in your calculator? Divided by how much the urchin weighs, which is 64 grams. And what does that equal? You would need to eat how many urchins a day? 145 sea urchins a day, Theo. I sure hope you like sea urchins. All right, we saw how much a sea otter needs to eat in a day. They eat a lot of sea urchins. So what else do they eat besides sea urchins? We've got a few things here. I don't have all 130 that biologists have recorded, but we picked up a few things out of the tide pools and areas around Kodiak where sea otters like to hunt. So let's start here. We already looked at the sea urchins. We know that sea urchins like to graze, so we often find them in areas that have seaweed or kelp forests. They love to eat bull kelp. With those 5 teeth, they graze at the bull kelp. These ones are green urchins, the small ones. Now this guy is called a red sea urchin. And as you can see, it's much bigger. This would be a real big meal if a sea otter caught this one. You can see it's got waving tentacles, which are 2 feet that it helps to move around. And I don't know if I'll be able to pick this guy up because he's stuck on really tight to the bottom, so I'm gonna leave him. But on the bottom is its mouth. So as it moves along, it would eat algae and seaweed. So I'm gonna write that down on my list. If you have this list, you can write the names of each of these animals. If you don't, you can just write it down on a piece of paper or your whiteboard. So I'm gonna put sea urchin. All right, Theo, let's look at somebody else here we haven't seen before. You wanna try picking something up? Okay, take it off fast, pull fast. Ah, you got it. Do you know what this is?
A sea star.
A sea star, very good. So everybody, you can write down sea star. Now you can see sea stars typically have 5 arms, but there's some that have 6 or even more. Sunflower stars can have like arms in the 30s. Picnapoo. This guy's making a little mess. So on the bottom of the sea star is its mouth. You can see its stomach is poking out a little bit right there. That's the way sea stars eat. They poke out their stomach when they find something yummy like a clam, and they stick their stomach inside the clam shell, which they've pried open just a little bit with these arms covered in tube feet. Now, when a sea otter finds a sea star to eat, it likes to nibble off the tips of the arms and suck out the inside parts. Sea stars aren't their favorite food. Sea stars don't have a ton of nutrition in them, but they can be eaten. What's this one here?
Sea cucumber.
A sea cucumber. I use both hands to support this very floppy sea cucumber. There you go. Now it looks spiky, but it's actually really soft and mushy. But there are 5 bands of muscle in here, which are good to eat. So sea otters can eat them. People eat them too. They're related to sea stars and sea urchins. See, they've got some tube feet down here. Now they crawl along the ocean floor and they suck up the sediment and find little particles of food to eat in the sediment. So I'm going to write down sea cucumber. You can too. Sea cucumber. All right, Theo, why don't we look in this tank? We can see in here something else that sea otters eat. Do you know what this one's called?
Scallop?
Scallop. People like to eat scallops too.
I had scallops last week.
Yeah. Were they good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wrapped with bacon.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is a scallop. Probably the one you ate came from a much bigger shell. So scallops can grow very large and thus have a bigger piece of meat in them for otters or people to eat. This is a tiny one. It wouldn't make much of a meal. These ones over here are called jingles. They're a kind of shelled animal that's got a bivalve, which has got 2 shells here that open up and also has some meat inside of it that they would eat. The animal lives inside the shell. Now you can see that they like to stick to things like rocks. So they're going to be stuck to a rocky substrate. Some scallops live in the sand though, like weather vanes. So they're on the bottom in sand. So on your piece of paper, you can write scallop. That's S-C-A-L-L-O-P. And jingle. We can find jingle shells out here. You often see them washed up on the beach. Let's see, what else do we have here? Let's bring the dead fish. Now, sea otters would catch this guy alive. This is a herring. It's been frozen, so it doesn't look too lively. But it's a herring, and herrings live in the deep ocean or out far from the coast. However, they do come in to the kelp forests, to the coast, to spawn, which means that's where they lay their eggs. They lay their eggs on the kelp fronds, and that's where the sea otters can run into the herring and catch them. So you can write herring, Herring. What else do we have? Ooh, okay. What is that big blob? That big orange blob down there is called a gumboot chitin. And it's kind of like a snail. It's got a mouth under here that grazes on rocks, grazes algae. And underneath that outer covering, it's got these plates to protect it. So you often see these attached to rocks in the tide pool. And an otter would need to pull really hard to get it off the rock. But it's got a nice meaty body in there to eat. This one here, you want to pick it up, Theo? Here, you grab it.
Snail.
What is it?
Snail.
Snail. Yeah, it's called a triton. This kind of snail is a predatory snail, and it'll eat other small animals. There's other kinds of snails that graze on algae, but this would also make a really nice meal for a sea otter, or part of a meal, right? So you can write snail on your list, and chitin is spelled C-H-I-T-O-N.
Chitin.
Yep. Okay, now we're getting over to some of these guys.
Exciting.
Do you know what these are? Hermit crabs. Yeah. Now, hermit crabs, you might have seen in tide pools. Sometimes there's often lots of little tiny hermit crabs. These ones are big. The tiny ones live in the tide pools. These bigger ones live a little bit deeper. Now, hermit crabs are special crabs because they live in snail shells or some other kind of shell that they've taken as their covering because they have soft bodies that need protection. You want to pick one up? Mm-hmm. Now, a sea otter could just grab a hold and pull this guy right out of its shell and eat it right up. So on your sheet, on your list here, you can write hermit, H-E-R-M-I-T, crab. So hermit crabs can make a nice little snack.
But the other.
Yeah, you want to pick that one up too?
Oh,
Oh, it's hiding. Yep, that's a good shell because you can pull all the way in there and hide. All right, put that one down. Now we'll look at our last toe over here.
they're trying to escape.
What's in here, Theo?
Crabs.
More crabs, two different kinds of crabs. Now these crabs you're not going to see in the tide pool because they're big, but they live a little bit deeper. And do you feel like you want to try to pick one up?
No, pinch.
Here, I'll pick this guy up. This is a tanner crab, which people like to eat, along with sea otters. Yeah.
Hi.
So, and this other one is called the lyre crab. That's L-Y-R-E. How do they feel?
Bumpy.
Bumpy? Kind of hard, huh? So now we're going to think about where all these animals live in the ocean. I've got a drawing here of the ocean. And if you don't have this drawing in front of you, you can actually make your own. It's just the ocean waves and some of the land going down, some rocks, and then going down to sand. And then here's a kelp forest with kelp floating, and then some smaller kinds of seaweed, and then up here would be your tide pool. All right, so, well, let's start with the urchins again, Theo. Here, you draw. Where do you think urchins live? So this is the ocean, this is the water, surface.
So urchins?
Yeah, we know they like, what do they like to eat? Kelp. So, yep, they'd be in the kelp forest. You can draw an urchin there.
Sometimes I see them at tide pools.
Yep, sometimes they're in tide pools grazing there too. All right, what about those sea stars? Where do you think they might be? Sometimes they're in tide pools, we see them there. Sea stars can live from shallow to really deep. They like to hide under rocks, especially the small little ones. Yep, those big sunflower stars live deeper out there. And let's think about, let's see, what about that herring? We talked about it comes in to lay its eggs where? What did it lay its eggs on?
Sand.
Not on the sand, but on the kelp fronds. So you can draw a herring up there.
Draw two.
Draw two herring, okay. And then crabs, well, they like to eat all sorts of things. They crawl along the bottom looking for dead fish or maybe smaller animals that they can grab and eat. Now, if you're a small animal, you probably want to do what? You want to hide somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Now, a really good hiding place is right here at the bottom of the kelp. They have what's called a holdfast. It's kind of like the roots of the kelp plant. And it's kind of like an apartment building or something, because it's got all these nooks and crannies in it, and all the little animals like to hide in there. So baby crabs, baby snails, brittle stars, baby sea stars, they all hide in there. So the bigger animals are going to come into that kelp forest looking for little animals to eat. What about clams? They're probably underneath the sand, yeah. Okay, that's pretty good. So, you know what we forgot? We forgot our sea otter. Where does our sea otter? It's gonna be around here too, because these are all things the sea otter likes to eat. Now, we've seen that a lot of these animals, these sea otters like to eat, hang out in or around the kelp forest. And the otters like to hang out around the kelp forest because that's where a lot of their food is. And another cool thing about kelp and otters is that the mommies, the otter mommies, can use the kelp to protect their babies when they go hunt for food. If you're an otter mommy, you don't want to be holding on to your baby while you're diving down, and trying to find your food with one hand. You're going to want to leave your baby at the surface. So you're going to grab a piece of kelp, wrap your baby up in it so it doesn't go anywhere, and then dive down and get your food. Come back, and there's your baby right where you left it. So the kelp is important to the sea otter mommies too, to keep their babies in one spot. So when we're looking at this, we think, wow, what's in common here in this picture? That kelp forest is pretty important. It provides habitat for the little baby animals to hide in. It provides food for other animals to come and hunt. And it provides a great habitat for the otters to come and find food, and the herring come to lay their eggs there. What would happen, do you think, if the otters left? What would the urchins do? Would they be happy?
Yeah.
The urchins would be happy because there's nobody there to eat them. They're so prickly, nobody else really wants to eat them too much. So the urchins, they would have an urchin party, and they would start eating lots of kelp. And then they would make lots of urchin babies. And so suddenly there'd be lots of urchins everywhere eating all that kelp. And gosh, if that kelp is gone, well then none of those other baby animals have anywhere to hide, and the herring doesn't have anywhere to lay its eggs, and the other animals don't have somewhere to find food, and they probably all go look somewhere else. So those otters play a pretty important role in the kelp forest by keeping those urchins from eating all the kelp.
Hello, my name is Svitka Düsterlo, and I am the director of the Ocean Science Discovery Lab. I'm going to do the summary for our sea otter unit today. So, when we think back at the end of the 1700s, here in Kodiak, the Russians came, they were exploring on their sailboats the ocean, and they came to this coast and found Kodiak. And at that time, there were a lot of sea otters in the ocean. And many of the Russian explorers were also fur hunters. So they started setting up a fur trade from Alaska back to Russia. When you look at a sea otter, it has this very luxurious pelt. And the first thing that people usually want to do when they have a sea otter pelt is put it around them. Doesn't that feel good?
Yes.
Just having a coat of sea otter pelt. So in Russia it was also very cold, so sea otter pelts could keep you nice and warm. Some of them were also sold to China. In China there was some royalty, and they liked to decorate themselves with luxurious sea otter pelts as well. So the pelts were very, very valuable. One of those sea otter pelts could bring a hunter so much money that they could live for a whole year from that. So it was, in a way, it was like the gold rush. People were coming because there was so much money to be had in hunting sea otters. When they first came, at the end of the 1700s, there were many, many sea otters. And the sea otters were everywhere, basically along the Alaskan Peninsula, all the way to Oregon and Washington and down to California. There were many sea otters. So when we think about what we learned today, many sea otters mean what for the sea urchin populations?
Not that many.
Not that many. Okay, so shall I say few?
Yeah.
Same thing, huh? Few. So if we have a lot of sea otters, we have few sea urchins because they eat so many of them, right?
Yeah.
And when we have few sea urchins, what does that mean for our kelp forests?
Lots of kelp.
Lots of kelp, because the sea urchins are not eating so much. And we talked about the kelp forest being habitat for other animals like little crabs and little clams and small fish. So when we have lots of kelp, do we have a lot of those other animals, or
Yes.
fewer of them?
More.
Yes, lots.
Yeah.
Lots of others. I'm just going to call them others. Lots of others. And by that we mean crabs, fish, clams, little worms, all those little animals that live in the kelp forests. Great. So now our hunters came and they hunted sea otters a lot. And it went on for almost 100 years. By the beginning of the 1900, so this was the 1700s, the late 1700s, and by early 1900, there were almost no sea otters left. So the hunters would go out, they would not find sea otters anymore. When we think about our sea urchin population, if we have no sea otters left, What happens to the sea urchins?
Lots of sea urchins.
Great. Lots of sea urchins because they don't end up being sea otter dinner anymore, right?
Yes.
So lots of them around. And what do they eat and what happens then?
There will be not that much kelp.
Great. Not so much kelp. And what does that mean for those others? Those little crabs?
Not that many others.
Yeah, they don't have anywhere to live and hide, and the predators will get them more easily because they can't go hide. So, not many others. Okay, now in 1900, the American government started to put the sea otter under protection. They didn't want them to go completely extinct. And they passed an act, a law, that you could no longer hunt sea otters. Now, to this day, that law is in effect. We are not allowed to hunt sea otters. There's one exception, Alaskan Native people, because it's part of their culture. They may hunt 1 sea otter per year per person. But the rest of us are not allowed to hunt those sea otters. So little by little, the sea otter populations started to recover. And we now have some sea otters. In fact, in some places, we're getting a lot of sea otters back. Here in Alaska, they have recovered very, very well. Around Kodiak, we can now see sea otters almost every time we go to the beach, right? Yeah. When I first came here, that wasn't the case. It was kind of rare to see a sea otter. But now it's really common, and we have some sea otters. Do we also have sea urchins?
Not too many.
Not too many, but we do. Do you sometimes see them?
Yeah. So some sea urchins.
So some sea urchins, yeah. I know you're a lucky boy and get to go to the beach a lot with your mom. So you get to see them there sometimes.
Yeah.
What about kelp?
More kelp. Some kelp.
Yeah, we have some kelp. Some kelp. And?
Some others.
All right, some others. So when we have some sea otters in our ecosystem, there's kind of a balance. It all balances out. But when we think about what we talked about in the very beginning of this lesson about that keystone, remember this bridge? Can you take the keystone out? So how is our sea otter similar to that keystone that's holding everything together when you look at our summary here?
Will they protect kelp forests and others?
They protect kelp forests and others. That's a great way to say it. They are the key to what kind of ecosystem we have. Whether we have an ecosystem with some balance in it, some kelp, some sea urchins, some others, or whether we have an ecosystem when we don't have sea otters, where we don't have a lot of kelp forests, or whether our ecosystem, when we have too many sea otters in an area, we might end up with a lot of kelp. However, when we have a lot of sea otters, they also eat a lot. So in some areas you end up with, for example, if you have an area with a lot of clams and crab, and you have a lot of sea otters, they will actually eat a lot of those shellfish then too. But our sea otter is the keystone to our ecosystem and kind of determines what it looks like underwater, what other animals we have. Thank you.